In this video, we will learn what scientific method is and what are the various steps that are followed in scientific method. So scientific method basically is a way scientists learn and study the world around them. Here is the flowchart that we usually follow when we are trying to solve a problem using the scientific method. This is just a recommended, suggested order. Does not mean that we always strictly follow this. For example, in this flowchart, it says the scientific method starts with a problem or a question. However, a lot of times when you are making observations, that is when you come up with questions. So if that is the case, then the observation step would come first and then we would state the problem. Whatever the case is, once we have a question or a problem stated clearly and we know what we are trying to figure out, we come up with a hypothesis. Hypothesis is an educated guess, kind of like a prediction of what you think is going to happen or what do you think is the result of your experiment. Once you have your hypothesis, you test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. This is the stage where we think about the variables, what we are going to test, what we are going to measure, how we are going to control our experiment. When you are doing your experiment, you are collecting and recording data. What kind of data you will collect depends on your question, it depends on your experimental setup. Once you have your data, you look at your data closely, you try to make connections, you look for patterns, and you make a conclusion. Conclusion is a statement of what the result of your experiment is. When you make conclusion, you relate back to the hypothesis and you say whether your hypothesis turned out to be true or not and what else you observed and what you learned by doing that experiment. And as an end result of the experiment and the process of scientific method, you communicate and you share your results. This is what scientists do all the time. They do not live in a world by themselves. They are constantly and regularly sharing their ideas with other people, their fellow scientists, taking their feedback, testing and retesting, and trying to find out solutions to the problems in the world around us. Let's look at each one of these steps in a little more detail. The first step we said was a problem or a question, and the question or the problem may arise when you are making observations or you are just casually looking at some things and you come up with a question. When we are doing scientific method, when we are solving a problem using scientific method, at this stage we will try and stick to questions that begin with how does or how can. And the reason we are doing this is these questions that begin with how does or how can lend themselves to scientific method and experimental setup better than other questions. As you move to higher classes, you may not always use how does, how can questions, but to begin with in 6th grade, we will try and use how does, how can questions. Once you have your question stated clearly, you will share your question always with a teacher or your group mates, and then you will then go on to set up your experiment. Here are some examples. Some of these questions are, the first one is a good question. How does the slope of a ramp affect the distance of a marble travels? This is a good question because in the question we state what we're going to test. So this question clearly tells you that you are going to be testing with slope of a ramp, and you are going to figure out whether the slope of the ramp affects the distance a marble travels. So you know what you're going to change, and as a result of the change, what you're going to measure. So that's a good question. The second question is not a good question. It's the first thing, it starts with a why, which does not lend itself to experimental setup. The third question is a yes or no question, and again, a bad question if you were to follow a scientific method. So we never use yes or no questions when we are trying to solve problems using the scientific method. Observations, we already talked about this. Sometimes when we are making observations, we come up with questions, or once we have our question, we make more observations about the scenario and the whole idea of setting up the question. When you are making observations, you make sure you make qualitative observations about the quality of the object using your five senses, and you make quantitative observation which involves numbers or measurements. So we try to make all kinds of observations in as much detail as possible. Once you have your question stated, you've made some observations, you come up with a hypothesis. Hypothesis is a statement of what you think is going to happen in your experiment. And how we state a hypothesis is using the if, then, because format. If I do this, then this would happen because you explain why it would happen. We'll learn a little more about writing the hypothesis in if, then, because format once we discuss what variables are. So for example, here are some examples of good hypothesis. If I keep the plant on a windowsill compared to that in a closet, then the plant on the windowsill will be taller because plants grow better with sunlight. This is a good example of a hypothesis. We have used the if, then, because format. And just by reading the hypothesis, I can understand, I can visualize what the problem is. This hypothesis clearly states, or we could conclude by reading this hypothesis, that someone is trying to do an experiment, putting one plant on a windowsill and the other one in a closet, and they're trying to find out which plant will grow taller. So they have what we call as a manipulated variable. They're changing the location of the plant. In the hypothesis, we know what they're going to be recording, what kind of data they will be collecting, which is the responding variable. They're going to be collecting the height of the plant. And in this hypothesis, we know the person is making an educated guess. They have a good guess how plants grow better with sunlight. Read the second hypothesis and see if that makes sense to you. Once you have your hypothesis, you are ready to experiment or test your hypothesis. Before you set up your experiment, it's very important that you list all the materials you will be using in the experiment and write a draft for the procedure that you will be using. Procedure is written in a step-by-step format. It should be written in as much detail as possible so that someone who reads your procedure and would like to redo the experiment, they could just follow your steps and replicate and redo the same experiment. Now, when we talk about experiment, we first need to think about what we're going to test and what we are going to measure in the experiment. Also, very important, what are the control variables? How are we going to make this a fair experiment? So, one of the important terms that is used when we talk about experiments is variable. So, variable, as you all might already know, in normal English language, variable means something that can change. So in an experiment, something that can be changed is a variable. Now there are three different types of variables in an experiment, and we'll learn what each one of those variable means and what's the significance of each variable in the experiment. The first variable, we'll call it the manipulated variable. It's the part of the experiment that you change. When you are thinking about your question, this is the part of your question that you want to test. For example, if we look back at our plant experiment, the amount of light or the location was the manipulated variable. So you decided to keep one of the plants on a windowsill and the other plant inside the closet. So this was your decision. This is something that you wanted to test, and we call it the manipulated variable. The second type of variable is the responding variable. This is the thing that you measure because of what you changed. So again, going back to our plant experiment, we were measuring the height of the plant as a result of the difference in location. So we were trying to see which plant grows taller, the one on the windowsill or the one that we kept in closet. So the responding variable is the part of the experiment that you measure, that you collect data on. The third type of variable is the control variable. This is a very important part of the experiment, and you really need to spend a lot of time thinking about what your control variables will be. Control variables are the conditions that should be the same so your experiment is fair. For example, again going back to our plant example, what are the conditions that should be the same for both the plants so it's a fair experiment? Some of the control variables that come straight to my head as I'm thinking about this experiment are the type of soil. I will use the same type of soil for both the plants. I will use the same type of pots. The size of the pots should be the same. The amount of soil should be the same. The amount of water that I will give to both the plants will be the same. the type of water that I choose to give to both the plants should be the same. So everything else stays the same except for your manipulated variable. So you will make sure that everything else stays the same except for part of the experiment that you are changing. And in this experiment, it's the location, the plant experiment. We are just experimenting with the location, and we are trying to keep everything else the same. Okay. The next step is collecting data. And when you are doing your experiment, or as you are planning your experiment, it's very important that you think about how you're going to organize your data. So one of the easiest ways to organize data is using data tables or charts. Again, you'll have to spend some time thinking about what's the best way to record your data. How many columns would you like in your data? How many rows? What will you put in the columns? What will you add in the rows? And so forth. Once we have our data table and charts, a lot of times we graph the data so we get a better picture of what we actually observed when we were doing the experiment. The last but one step is making a conclusion. And conclusion is a statement of describing what you found when you tested, what you found when you finished the experiment. When you are doing your conclusion, you always relate back to hypothesis. When I say relate back to hypothesis, what I mean is you go look back at your hypothesis and see whether the results that you got are the same as you predicted or are they different. And it's okay if your results are different than what you guessed would happen. And this happens to the scientists all the time. This happens to me all the time. This will happen to you. So it's okay if your hypothesis does not turn out to be true. The important piece here is making connections and analyzing data. What does it mean to analyze data? It means looking back at your experiment, looking back at your hypothesis, and wondering why your results came out the way they did. Do you observe any patterns? Does your data reflect something beyond what you were testing? If you were to do this all over again, how would you do it differently? If you were to think of another experiment related with this topic, what would that be? And so on. So conclusion is actually pretty much the last step, where you're doing a lot of thinking and putting your thoughts as to what all you observed while you were doing the experiment. And again, an important piece is relating back to your hypothesis, what you thought would happen and what actually happened. Are they same or are they different? The last piece of the scientific method is communicating or sharing results. And this is an important piece because if the scientists would not share what they found or would not communicate with other people, then our world today would be very different. Scientists always share. They are always open to feedback from other people, from their fellow scientists, from several different categories of people, so they can improve their work, so they know if they did something wrong and they can go back and fix it. So as a science student, whenever you do an experiment, you will be doing a lab write-up. We will learn more about the format for the lab write-up in 6th grade later on. But remember that communicating what you did is an important piece of doing science. Here are some vocabulary words. So if you did not catch on everything that I said during this video, please go over these vocabulary words. And I'd like you to note these down in your notebook. And understand something, make sure you check with me in class. We will review these together in class, but you may want to highlight or underline anything that you have questions about, so you will remember to check in with me when I see you. Okay, thank you.